Nobody saw her coming. She was standing at the edge of the emergency tent when the first shot cracked open the Montana sky. A quiet woman in a blue volunteer vest, holding a tray of gauze pads, watching the crowd scatter like birds off a wire. Nobody looked at her twice. Nobody had all morning. A reporter had already called her a bandage girl to her face, and the security captain had told her twice to stay behind the rope. She was a nurse. She was nobody. Then a man hit the ground 30 feet away, 210 pounds of Navy SEAL, bleeding from his shoulder, one hand still on his sidearm. And she dropped the tray, walked straight toward him, and said two words that made him stop breathing. Words that were classified. Words that only one person in the world was supposed to know. If this story already has you gripping your seat, stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about the quiet ones. Hit like, subscribe so you don't miss a single part, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The drive into Crestfield had taken Emma Dalton 4 hours through mountain roads. She hadn't traveled in 3 years, and she spent most of it not thinking about the memorial event she was headed to, and a lot of it thinking about the coffee she'd spilled on her khakis at the gas station outside Billings. She was good at filling her head with small problems. It kept the bigger ones quiet. She'd volunteered for the medical support team because a colleague had dropped out and asked her to take the slot, and because Emma had a hard time saying no to people who needed things. It wasn't sentimentality. It was more like a reflex she'd never managed to retrain. She pulled into the parking field behind the Crestfield Fairgrounds at 7:43 in the morning, signed in at the volunteer table, got her blue vest and her lanyard, and carried her kit bag to the emergency tent near the east side of the main stage. The annual Ironfield Memorial Ceremony drew about 3,000 people to this part of western Montana every summer. Families of veterans, active duty personnel in dress uniforms, local officials, a few reporters with cameras, a few more with notebooks. It was a serious event, organized around a central monument to soldiers lost in overseas operations over the past 2 decades. There were speeches, a flyover, a band, rows of folding chairs, and an enormous American flag that snapped and cracked in the summer wind. Emma set up the emergency tent the way she set up every workstation, methodically, without wasted motion, everything within arm's reach. Trauma kit on the left, IV supplies center, airway equipment right. Her colleague for this day was a paramedic named Roy, who was maybe 24 and enthusiastic in a way that Emma found exhausting before 9 in the morning. He told her he'd worked 3 of these events before, and that the most serious thing he'd treated was a heat rash. "Knock on wood," Emma said. Roy knocked on the folding table. It wasn't wood. He didn't seem to notice. The morning moved slowly. Emma checked equipment, drank bad coffee from a paper cup, and watched the crowd fill in around the monument. She recognized the rhythm of military ceremony, the particular kind of silence that fell when the honor guard marched, the way people's postures changed when the flag was raised. She'd stood in formations like that once, not in a dress uniform, not in public, not anywhere that a photograph would be taken, but she understood the language of it, the specific weight of it. She was unwrapping a fresh pack of nitrile gloves when the reporter found her. He was maybe 35, lanyard from a regional news outlet, hair product that smelled like it cost more than Emma's lunch. He'd already spoken to 2 of the uniformed medical officers near the main tent and appeared to be doing a human interest piece on the event's support staff. He stopped in front of her station, looked at her vest, looked at her kit bag, and then looked at her with the kind of expression that said he was already formatting the quote before she'd opened her mouth. "You with the volunteer medical team?" "Yes." "What's your role out here?" "Emergency nursing support." He wrote something down. "So basically handing out bandages if someone trips on a tent stake." Emma looked at him. "Something like that." "Great." He capped his pen. "We appreciate the bandage people." He walked away. Roy, who had heard the whole thing, made a face like he was waiting for Emma to say something sharp. She didn't. She checked the expiration date on a bag of saline solution and set it back in the bin. That was fine. She'd been called worse by people who knew more about her than that reporter ever would. The ceremony began at 9 o'clock with a 21-gun salute that made a woman in the front row flinch and grab her daughter's hand. There were 4 speeches, a state senator, a retired general, the mayor of Crestfield, and a Gold Star mother who spoke for 11 minutes without a single note and made 3/4 of the crowd cry. Emma stood at the edge of the tent and listened to all of it. Not because she had to, because some things deserve to be listened to. She was watching the honor guard carry a wreath toward the monument when the security captain stopped by for the second time that morning. Captain Harlan Pruitt was ex-sheriff's department, built wide across the shoulders, running an event security team of 12. He had already stopped by the tent at 8 to tell her that the medical volunteers were to remain in the designated support zone unless called upon, and he delivered that instruction in the specific tone of someone who expected to be ignored and was preemptively annoyed about it. Now he was back. "Nurse," he said. He hadn't learned her name. "I need you to step back behind the rope line. We've got VIPs moving through this corridor in about 10 minutes. I'm part of the medical support team. This is my designated station. Your station is back there." He pointed toward a spot about 40 feet behind where she was standing, which would have put her behind a crowd of people and a canvas divider with no line of sight to the main stage. Event protocol. Medical support stays out of primary sight lines. Emma looked at the location he was pointing to. She looked back at him. "If someone has a cardiac event in the front section, I need 30 seconds to reach them, not 2 minutes. There are military medics on the other side of the stage." "Then what am I here for?" He smiled in a way that wasn't a smile. "Insurance. Stay behind the rope." She moved behind the rope. She moved her kit bag with her. She did not move her eyes from the front section of the crowd. Roy materialized beside her. "That guy's been treating everyone on the volunteer team like that." "Noticed. You're not going to say anything?" "I'm saying plenty," Emma said, "just not out loud." The ceremony resumed. The senator returned to the podium for a second brief address. The band played a slow, measured version of a song that Emma recognized but couldn't have named. The crowd stood. The flag was lowered to half-staff. That was when she first noticed the man in the dress uniform near the east flank of the stage. He was standing slightly apart from the other officers, which wasn't unusual for that kind of event. What was unusual was the way he was standing, not at ease, not at attention, but somewhere in between, weight shifted slightly forward, jaw tight, eyes doing rapid lateral sweeps of the crowd. Emma had spent enough time around people managing high stress to recognize the signs. His right hand was opening and closing at his side. She kept watching him. The senator finished. There was applause. A color guard moved into position near the monument, and there was a movement of the crowd, people shifting, standing, cameras going up. And in that movement, Emma lost sight of the officer for about 90 seconds. When she found him again, he was 20 feet closer to the stage and his hand was no longer empty. It happened fast after that. The first shot didn't come from him. It came from the north side of the fairgrounds, somewhere above the tree line. A sharp, flat crack that echoed off the mountains behind the stage and sent the nearest crowd section into immediate motion. Emma was already moving before the second shot, not toward safety, toward the medical kit she'd set down 3 feet behind her. She grabbed it in one hand and was scanning the scene in front of her before the screaming started in earnest. The officer in the dress uniform dropped. Not because he'd been hit, at least not yet. He went down hard onto one knee, and it was the movement of a man whose body had overridden his mind, whose training had thrown him to a defensive crouch before his conscious brain had finished processing the sound. But then he didn't get back up. He stayed there, breathing in short, rapid bursts, left hand pressed to the ground, right hand, still holding the sidearm that Emma now saw clearly for the first time, raised to somewhere between the crowd and the stage. Security officers scattered. Harlan Pruitt was shouting into a radio. People were running in 4 directions at once. Emma moved through the crowd the way she always moved through chaos, efficiently, quietly, without announcing herself, because announcing yourself in chaos was a waste of time and breath. She was vaguely aware of someone grabbing her arm and telling her to get back. She kept walking. The officer was big. Over 6 feet, maybe 200 pounds of muscle that was currently locked in a battle between the room his body was standing in and whatever room his mind had gone back to. His breathing was audible from 8 feet away. Too fast, too shallow, wrong pattern for someone physically injured. His eyes were tracking movement but not registering faces. When a security officer tried to approach from his left flank, the man's weapon arm rotated 30 degrees in that direction, and the security officer stopped moving very abruptly. "Nobody touch him!" Pruitt was yelling. "Back up! Back up!" There was blood. Emma could see it now, a dark, wet patch on the left shoulder of the dress uniform spreading slowly. He'd been hit, or he'd hit something when he fell, or it was an old wound that had torn open under the stress of whatever his mind was currently doing to him. Either way, he needed treatment. And either way, nobody was getting close enough to give it to him. Emma got within 6 feet and crouched down, making herself smaller, moving slowly, the way she'd learned to move in situations where the wrong body language could turn a bad situation critical. "Ma'am, I am telling you to get back." Pruitt's hand was on her shoulder. She shrugged it off. Not roughly, just completely. She looked at the man on the ground, really looked at him. His face, the particular way his jaw was set, the specific geography of the scar that ran from his left ear toward the corner of his mouth. She'd never seen his face before in her life. She'd never needed to. She'd known him for 3 years through a radio frequency and a call sign, and the sound of his voice when things went wrong and when things went right, and the one night they almost didn't come back at all. She moved to within 4 feet. Pruitt grabbed her arm again, harder this time. "Lady, that man is armed and in crisis," Emma said 2 words. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly and with the right register and the right weight behind them, because she knew exactly how they needed to sound for them to cut through whatever he was hearing in his head. "Ghosthawk, stop!" The man on the ground stopped breathing. Then he started again. The weapon arm lowered 4 inches. His head turned toward her, not fast, not sudden, but with the particular focused motion of a man who has just heard something that belongs in a different category than everything else around him. His eyes found her face. For a moment, nobody moved. The crowd noise was still there, crying, shouting, the sound of someone's chair scraping concrete. But in the immediate circle around the 2 of them, it was completely, specifically quiet. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper, like it was coming from somewhere that took effort to access. "Someone who needs you to put the weapon down," Emma said, "and then I need you to let me look at your shoulder. That call sign is classified, I know. Can you set the weapon down for me?" He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then his arm lowered the rest of the way, and his hand opened and the sidearm touched the ground. Pruitt made a move toward it, and Emma put her hand up. "Give him a second." Pruitt stopped. She didn't look at him to confirm it. She just held the eye contact with the man in front of her and waited until she felt the specific quality of the air between them shift, the way it did when a person's body stopped being at war with itself. She opened her kit and got to work. His name, she would confirm later from the event roster, was Commander Nolan Ray's decorated SEAL, 8 combat deployments, currently assigned to a training rotation at a base in Nevada. He'd been standing in for a colleague at the memorial ceremony and had been close to the stage when the shot came in from the north perimeter. The bullet had grazed the upper left shoulder, not deep, not arterial, not immediately life-threatening, but enough to bleed and enough that combined with the sound of the shot and the crowd noise and whatever private interior architecture a man builds after years of that kind of work, it had sent him somewhere that wasn't the Crestfield Fairgrounds anymore. Emma worked quickly. She cut the fabric away from the wound with trauma shears, assessed the entry and exit, confirmed no major vessel involvement. She irrigated with saline, applied pressure, talked to him the whole time in the low, even voice she'd learned to use in situations where the goal was to give someone's nervous system something calm to follow. He was coming back to himself by inches. She could see it happen, the small recalibrations, the way he focused on her hands, then her face, then the instrument of her voice. "How do you know that call sign?" he asked. "Long story. That's a classified designation from a 2019 operation." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, security had established a perimeter, pushing the crowd back, and she could hear the distant sound of sirens approaching from the highway. Military medics would be here soon. She had maybe 4 more minutes of this window. "Shadow 1, he said. Not a question. He said it the way someone says a name they stopped believing was real. Emma kept her eyes on the wound. "Hold still. You were the voice on our radio." His voice had changed. Not louder, not different in volume, but different in weight. "During Hollow Ridge, you were the one who—" I said, "Hold still." He held still. She finished the compression wrap, double-checked the seal, checked his pulse. Strong, regular, coming down from the spike. His color was better. His breathing had normalized into something that wasn't trying to kill him. Military medics arrived at the perimeter of the circle 2 minutes later. 2 of them, efficient, moving fast. Emma briefed them in 35 seconds: vitals, wound status, mechanism of injury, current mental state. They took over and she stepped back, and that was when she became aware of how many people were watching. The crowd that hadn't fled was still there. Hundreds of them, held behind the new perimeter that Pruitt's team had established, phones raised, watching. Several reporters, multiple cameras, a video crew from a local station. She picked up her kit bag and walked back toward the tent. Roy was standing at the edge of it with his mouth open. "What?" he started, then stopped, then started again. "What was that call sign?" "Nothing," Emma said. "That was classified military." "Roy, get me a fresh irrigation kit and stop talking." He got her the kit. He did not stop talking, not entirely, but she tuned the specific words out and kept her hands moving, restocking, reorganizing, because her hands needed something to do. Pruitt found her 3 minutes later. He looked different. Not smaller exactly, but recalibrated, the way people look when something has moved a wall they didn't know was there. "That officer," he said, "he's asking for you." "The medics have him. He's refusing further treatment until he can talk to you." Emma set down the package she was holding. She looked at Pruitt. He was not meeting her eyes the way he hadn't been able to stop meeting them an hour ago when he was telling her to get behind the rope. "The rope," she said. "What?" "Nothing." She picked up her kit bag. "Where are they?" She followed him to the field medic station on the west side of the stage. Nolan Reyes was sitting on a cot, shoulder-wrapped, 2 medics hovering at a respectful distance, talking into a radio about transport authorization. When Emma came through the tent flap, he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the ground, that specific focused attention of a man who has reorganized what he knows and is deciding what to do with the new version. "Sit down," she said. He didn't sit down. He was a SEAL. She hadn't expected him to. "Shadow 1 operated out of the 117th Tactical Intelligence Unit," he said. "Deactivated 4 years ago. Their file is sealed. Most of their operational history is coded above top secret." That's a lot of details for casual conversation. "I've been trying to figure out who Shadow 1 was since 2021. His voice was even. Not aggressive, even. "Because that person saved my unit from an ambush that would have killed all 7 of us and never got credit for it." Emma looked at him for a moment. A medic was pretending to check inventory near the far wall. "How's the shoulder?" she asked. "Emma Dalton," he said. "That's the name on your volunteer ID." "Good eyes. Is that your real name?" "It's the name on my nursing license." He was quiet. Then, "You're a nurse." "I'm a nurse." "You were also Shadow 1. Emma held his gaze without confirming or denying anything, which was its own kind of answer, and she knew it. Outside the tent, she could hear the situation unfolding, the second sweep of the north perimeter where the shot had come from, the controlled movement of law enforcement, the distant rotors of what she assumed was a military helicopter coming in from the nearest base. The ceremony was over. The grounds were becoming a different kind of organized, the kind that happens after. "I need you to listen to me," she said. "You were grazed. You're stable. When transport gets here, they're going to take you to Crestfield Regional, and they'll clean and close that properly, and then in about 6 hours, you're going to start feeling exactly how much the rest of today cost you physically. Don't try to talk to anyone official until you've slept." "I've got questions." "I know you do. A lot of them." "I know that too." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite an expression, more like the shadow of one, passing through. "You left," he said. "Shadow 1 just... The unit went dark and the personnel files were sealed and no one could account for where half of them went." Emma pulled the tent flap aside and checked the approach outside. The medics were wrapping up their radio call. She had maybe 90 seconds. "Some of us went where we were needed," she said, "and some of what we needed was to be somewhere quiet." "A hospital in where? Where are you based?" "Langton, 60 miles east." "You went from tactical intelligence operations to a hospital in Langton, Montana." "They have an ER. People need help there too." He stared at her. She could see him trying to make the pieces fit, not the facts, which he'd probably already arranged correctly, but the sense of it, the way someone's life could pivot on a point that size without leaving visible damage on the outside. "The reporter," he said suddenly. "Earlier. I saw him talking to you." Emma said nothing. "He called you a bandage person." His voice was flat. Something like that. And you didn't... He stopped. Started again. You let him say that. People say what they say. She looked at him. It doesn't change what I know, and it doesn't change what I can do. Never has. The medics finished their radio call, and one of them turned and made eye contact with Emma in a way that meant transport was 3 minutes out. She adjusted the strap of her kit bag. You need anything before I go? She asked Reyes. He was still watching her with that same quality of attention, intense and slightly unbalanced, like a man who has found the answer to a question he spent years formulating and is now working out what the answer cost him. There's going to be an inquiry, he said, about the shooter, about what happened today, about you. There will be, she agreed. Your name is going to come up. Probably. People are going to start asking how a volunteer nurse knew a classified call sign from a sealed military operation. Emma picked up her kit bag and looked at him one last time. Let them ask, she said. She was 4 feet from the tent exit when she heard him say her name. Not Dalton, not Shadow One, just a sound, quiet and oddly careful, the sound of a person choosing their words after a long time of choosing nothing. She stopped but didn't turn around. Why a nurse? He said. After everything you knew how to do, why that? She thought about Roy and his bad coffee. She thought about the woman in the front row who'd flinched at the gunshot and grabbed her daughter's hand. She thought about mornings in the ER at Langton when she'd worked 16 hours and eaten half a granola bar and still gotten it right when it mattered. Because people need help, she said, and I'm good at it. She walked out. Behind her, she heard Nolan Reyes exhale, long, slow, like a breath he'd been holding for 3 years without knowing it. The helicopter rotors were getting louder. The law enforcement sweep of the North Tree Line had found something. She could tell from the radio traffic she caught in fragments as she crossed the event grounds back toward the main medical tent. The shot had come from a specific location. A specific person had been at that location. And on 3 different phone screens that she passed on her way back, she could already see the video. A woman in a blue vest, crouching beside a man with a gun, saying 2 words. The comments were moving faster than she could read. Emma walked back to her station, set down her kit bag, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, and waited for whatever came next. The comments didn't stop moving. By the time Emma had restocked the irrigation kit and done a second sweep of the medical tent supplies, her phone had vibrated 11 times. She'd left it face down on the folding table and hadn't touched it. Roy kept glancing at it like it was a live grenade. You're not going to look at that? No. There are a lot of notifications. Roy. Right, sorry. The law enforcement activity on the north perimeter had intensified over the past 40 minutes. She could track it by sound, the specific quality of radio traffic, the positioning of vehicles, the way the remaining event staff were being redirected toward the east exit. A state police helicopter had made 2 low passes over the tree line. Whatever the shooter had left behind up there, they were working carefully. Harlan Pruitt came back to the tent at 12:17. He looked like a man who had spent the last hour and a half making phone calls he hadn't wanted to make. The event is officially closed, he said. Volunteer staff are being released. You're free to go. I know. He stood there another moment. He seemed to want to say something else, and whatever it was, he couldn't find the packaging for it. The video, he started. I've seen it's out there. There are a lot of people sharing it. Emma pulled off her gloves and dropped them in the waste bin. Captain Pruitt, is there a medical situation that needs my attention? No. Then I'm going to sign out, and I'm going to drive back to Langton. She picked up her kit bag. If someone from law enforcement needs to speak with me, they have my contact information from the volunteer registration form. He moved aside. She walked past him, signed out at the volunteer table, handed in her lanyard, and got into her car. She sat in the parking field for a while without starting the engine. The mountains to the west had clouds moving across them now, shadows running down the faces of the ridges in long, slow stripes. She watched that for a minute. Then she picked up her phone. 14 missed calls. 6 from a number she didn't recognize. 3 from her supervisor at Langton Memorial Hospital, Dr. Orrin Castle, who she had worked under for 2 years and who she'd once described to her sister as the most aggressively competent person she'd ever met. The other 5 were from a number with a Nevada area code, Reyes, somehow. Already. She didn't call any of them back. She started the car and drove. The road out of Crestfield ran east through a valley that opened up gradually, the mountains peeling back, the land flattening into the wide brown grasslands that dominated this part of the state. Emma had the windows down. She drove at exactly the speed limit. She thought about the compression wrap she'd put on Ray's shoulder and whether she'd tensioned the upper anchor correctly, and then stopped thinking about that because she had, and second-guessing things you'd done right was a waste of metabolic energy. She thought instead about the video. She hadn't watched it. She didn't need to. She knew what it showed. A woman in a blue vest crouching beside a man with a weapon, saying something that stopped him cold. The call sign would have been captured on audio. Maybe clearly, maybe not. There'd been crowd noise, distance, the ambient chaos of the aftermath of a gunshot. But enough people had been close enough that the words were probably already circulating in the comments and various guesses and approximations. Ghosthawk. In an operational context, that call sign had belonged to a SEAL unit that didn't officially exist. And the only people who had known it, outside the unit itself, were the intelligence operators who'd supported them from a remote station on a mountain in a country that was never named in any official document. Emma drove. She got back to Langton at 4:30 and went straight to the hospital because she had a shift starting at 5. And she was not the kind of person who called in because her day had been complicated. Dr. Castle found her in the staff locker room at 4:52, which meant he'd been watching for her. He was 61, thin, precise, with the specific energy of a man who had been saying exactly what he meant for 4 decades and found it baffling that other people didn't. "I've been calling you," he said. "I know. I was driving." "I've seen the video." Emma hung her kit bag in her locker and turned around. "What do you need from me, Oren?" He studied her for a moment with the expression he used when he was recalibrating. She'd seen it in triage situations, in staff meetings, once during a power outage that had lasted 6 hours and taken out half their monitoring equipment. It was the look of a man updating his working model. "There are 3 reporters in the lobby," he said. "Tell them I'm not available." "I did. They're still there." "Then they're camping out, and that's a facilities management problem, not mine." He didn't move. She raised an eyebrow. "Oren, I have a shift. The administrator wants to speak with you before you go on." "About what?" "About the—" He paused, and that pause was unusual for him, which meant he was more unsettled than he was showing. "About the potential liability implications of a hospital staff member using classified military information in a public setting during an active shooter incident." Emma looked at him. "Doris Langham," she said. It wasn't a question. Doris Langham was the hospital administrator, a woman who had spent 20 years turning Langton Memorial into a functioning institution through a combination of genuine organizational skill and the specific kind of self-protective caution that came from watching lawsuits eat hospitals alive. "She's concerned," Castle said carefully. "I did my job today. I treated a wounded patient. You also did something that—" Another pause. "That has generated significant public attention, and that involves what appears to be a classified military designation." "I'm aware." "Emma." His voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but deliberate. "I'm not interrogating you. I've worked with you for 2 years. I know what kind of nurse you are, but I need to understand what I'm dealing with before Doris puts this in front of the board." She sat down on the bench and was quiet for a moment. The locker room smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Somewhere down the hall, a cart was being wheeled across tile. "I have a past I don't talk about," she said. "It doesn't affect my work here. Today it turned out to be relevant. I used what I knew to stabilize a patient and prevent what could have been a more serious incident. That's the entirety of it." Castle absorbed this. "The classified designation. I'm not going to discuss the details of that. Were you military?" She met his eyes. "I'm a nurse. You've watched me work for 2 years. Has anything I've done in this building given you reason to doubt that?" "No," he said immediately. "Then let me go do my shift." He stepped aside. She went and did her shift. It was a bad night. 2 car accidents off the highway, 1 pediatric respiratory case that scared the hell out of everyone for about 40 minutes before resolving. A domestic violence situation that came in quiet and became loud and then became quiet again in a different way. Emma worked through all of it with the same controlled attention she brought to every shift. She didn't think about the fairgrounds. She didn't think about Ray's. She focused on the room she was in, the patient in front of her, the specific problem requiring a specific solution. That was the thing about emergency nursing that she'd found, after everything else, to be genuinely restorative. There was no ambiguity. The problem was in front of you. You either fixed it or you didn't, and you knew immediately which one. She got home at 2:15 in the morning and found a car parked outside her apartment building that she didn't recognize. It was a government vehicle. She knew that not from any marking, it was unmarked, a dark sedan, but from the specific configuration of it, the way it was parked, the antenna arrangement, the plate frame. She'd spent enough time around federal vehicles to pattern match them the way other people pattern matched makes and models. She went inside, went upstairs, and made coffee. At 2:43, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find two people, a man in his late 40s with close-cropped gray hair and the posture of someone who'd been military and had never entirely stopped being military, and a woman in her mid-30s in civilian clothes with a federal ID already held up at eye level. Emma Dalton? Yes. Special Agent Dara Foss, Defense Intelligence. This is Colonel Whitmore, SOCOM liaison. Can we come in? Emma looked at them. She looked at the ID. She stepped aside. They sat at her kitchen table. She did not offer them coffee, not because she was being unfriendly, but because it was almost 3 in the morning and she was tired, and they were federal agents who had parked outside her building, which meant this wasn't a social call, and coffee would have been a performance. Foss did most of the talking. The shooter at Crestfield had been identified. A man named Gerald Price, 43, former Army, discharged under circumstances that the agent declined to specify, with a documented history of grievances against military command structures. He'd been apprehended 2 miles from the fairgrounds 4 hours after the incident. He was currently in federal custody. Commander Reyes is stable, Colonel Whitmore said. It was the first thing he'd said since they came in. His voice was the measured kind, the kind trained not to give anything away. He wanted us to tell you that specifically. Good. He also, Foss said, filed a statement with his command regarding today's events. In that statement, he identified you by name and by a designation that... She paused. That required us to make some calls before we could come here. I imagine it did. Ms. Dalton, how long have you been in Langton? 2.5 years. And before that? I'd rather not answer that question without knowing specifically why you're asking it. Foss and Whitmore exchanged a look. Not a long one, just the quick calibration of two people who've developed shorthand. We're not here to create problems for you, Foss said. Then what are you here to do? Understand the situation. The video from today's event has been viewed, as of 2 hours ago, approximately 4 million times. There are several journalists attempting to identify the woman in the blue vest. Your name has not yet been publicly connected to the video, but that window is probably under 24 hours. Emma looked at the table. She thought about Castle's face in the locker room. She thought about Doris Langham and the word liability. The call sign, Whitmore said. Ghosthawk. You understand the implications of that being connected to a public video. I used it in a clinical context to de-escalate a patient in crisis. If that compromised something, I'm willing to discuss how to manage it. It didn't compromise the operation itself. Hollow Ridge was 4 years ago. The operational security window on that mission has passed. He paused. What it does is raise questions about the personnel file of an intelligence operator listed as transferred to civilian life with no further record. That was the arrangement. That was the arrangement, he agreed. And it worked for 2.5 years. Today changed the math. Emma sat back. She was very tired. She was also aware that she'd known, somewhere in the architecture of herself, that something like this would eventually occur. Not this specific shape. She couldn't have predicted Crestfield, couldn't have predicted Reyes at the ceremony, couldn't have predicted the video. But the general category of it. The idea that the life she'd built in Langton was built on a foundation that included a trap door. What do you need from me? She said. Right now? Nothing. Foss leaned forward slightly. We're here to tell you what's coming so you're not blindsided by it. Within the next 12 to 48 hours, your name will likely be publicly identified. When that happens, people are going to have questions about your background that the official record doesn't answer. Because the official record was redacted. Because the official record was sealed at your request. Emma didn't correct that. It was accurate, technically. And there are people, Whitmore said carefully, within certain command structures who are, not pleased about today's events drawing attention to the 117th. She looked at him. What kind of not pleased? He met her eyes. The kind that may attempt to characterize your actions today in a way that's unfavorable. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator made a small sound. They're going to say I acted without authorization, Emma said. Whitmore didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She thought about a cold room in 2019, a radio frequency, 7 men in a valley who didn't know yet that the approach they'd mapped was compromised, and the 43 minutes she'd spent threading them out of it one decision at a time. She thought about the debrief afterward, the officers who'd sat across the table from her and used words like overreach and unauthorized deviation and failure to follow established protocol, and how she'd sat there and listened to all of it and hadn't said a single word in her own defense because she had known, even then, that the words wouldn't have been the point. The 7 men had come home. That had been the point. I see, she said. I want to be clear, Foss said. We are not here representing those interests. We're here because Commander Reyes specifically requested that someone make contact with you before this became public. He was... A brief pause. He was insistent about that. Emma made a small sound that was almost a laugh. He would be. He also said, and I'm quoting because he was specific about the wording, that if anyone attempted to interfere with how today's events were characterized, he would personally see to it that the full operational record of Hollow Ridge was reviewed by everyone with the appropriate clearance, and several people without it. The almost laugh became an actual one, quiet and short. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. He said that. Word for word. She shook her head slowly. Reyes she'd known for years, his voice, his patterns, his particular stubbornness. And that was exactly something he would say, sitting on a cot with a wrapped shoulder and 2 medics hovering, deciding that the next thing he was going to do was make phone calls. Okay, she said. She straightened in her chair. What do I need to do? For tonight, nothing, Foss said. Sleep if you can. Don't speak to press. If the hospital contacts you before morning, refer them to... She slid a card across the table. That number. Emma looked at the card. She didn't pick it up. One question, she said. Go ahead. The people who want to characterize today unfavorably, how high up does that go? Foss and Whitmore exchanged another look. This one lasted longer. High enough, Whitmore said, that you should be careful. They left at 3:20. Emma sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, hands around a coffee cup she'd eventually poured herself, watching the steam. High enough that you should be careful. She turned that over. It had the shape of a warning and the weight of something more specific that he hadn't said. She knew, in the general way that people know things about institutions they've been part of, that there were officers who'd been involved in decisions around the 117th, who had reasons to want that chapter to stay closed. Not because anything illegal had occurred, at least not in any documentable way, but because the record of certain choices made during those operations, cross-referenced with the outcomes, would not reflect well on the people who'd made them. People who had since moved up. People who had since acquired titles and positions that would look different in the shadow of a revisited operational history. And now a video existed, viewed 4 million times and counting, that contained a classified call sign and the face of someone whose personnel file had been sealed for 2.5 years. Emma washed her coffee cup, dried it, put it away. She went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept. Her phone was going when she woke up at 7:30. Not vibrating, going, constant, the pattern of something that had been ringing intermittently for long enough that her subconscious had incorporated it into whatever she'd been dreaming about. She lay there for a moment and looked at the ceiling and then picked it up. 22 missed calls, most from numbers she didn't recognize, several from media outlets she could identify by area code and prefix. One from Doris Langham at 5:47 in the morning, which told her that the administrator had been up early and not happily. And one, time-stamped 6:53, from a number she recognized because it was the same one that had called her 3 times the day before. Reyes. She called him back. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was clearer than it had been the day before, the particular quality of someone who'd slept and taken something for pain and arrived at a decision about what happened next. They found your name, he said. No preamble. Already. There's a piece going up on a national outlet in about 2 hours. A journalist, someone who does military affairs coverage. She made the connection from the volunteer registration records. Your full name is in it. Emma was quiet. There's more, he said. She already knew from his tone that this was the part that mattered. Someone in command, I don't have a name yet, but I'm working on it, has provided background to at least 2 reporters characterizing your involvement at Crestfield as unsanctioned interference. The word they're using is reckless. They're framing it as a civilian with partial military background who inserted herself into an active incident and endangered both a patient and security personnel. The word reckless sat in the air of her bedroom. They're also suggesting, Reyes continued, his voice carefully controlled in a way she recognized as someone managing anger, that the call sign you used was improperly retained from your service period, that you shouldn't have had access to it, that you held on to classified material. Emma sat up and put her feet on the floor. Who? She said. I have 2 names I'm looking at. I'm not saying them on this line. How long do we have before the piece goes up? Hour and 40 minutes. She looked at the window. The morning outside was gray, clouds from the night before not yet burned off. Nolan. She used his first name without thinking about it. 2.5 years of silence and then 2 days. They're going to win this if they get the narrative out first. I know. I don't have documentation. My records are sealed. They can say whatever they want, and I have no official paper trail to push back with. I know that too. A pause. But I do. She went still. I filed a full operational debrief last night, he said. I invoked my right to attach personal testimony to the official record of Hollow Ridge. It's time-stamped and logged. It contains everything: the 2019 operation, the role of the Tactical Intelligence Support Team, specifically the operator-designated Shadow 1, and the specific sequence of decisions that brought my unit home. Another pause. And I gave a copy to Foss. Emma pressed her hand flat against her knee. You did that last night. I did that last night. You had a bullet graze in a dissociative episode 6 hours before that. I had a bullet graze, he said, with the specific emphasis of a man declining to discuss the rest of it. I've had worse, the filing stands. She exhaled. Outside, a car passed on the street below. The ordinary sound of it was strange, the mundane texture of a morning that was about to become something else entirely. They're still going to push the narrative, she said. Let them. My job is going to be fine, he said, or we're going to make sure of it. I'm making calls. Nolan. Emma. His voice shifted into something direct and unambiguous. You spent 43 minutes in 2019 keeping 7 people alive from a room no one was supposed to know existed. You did that without recognition, without credit, without so much as an official notation in a file anyone could read. You went home and became a nurse in Langton, Montana. Yesterday you stabilized me in a field and stopped something from getting significantly worse. She didn't say anything. They don't get to call that reckless, he said. Not while I'm breathing. The line was quiet for a moment. Then her phone buzzed with a new notification, and she looked at the screen, and what she saw made her stand up from the bed. The article was already up. It had gone live 40 minutes ahead of schedule, which meant someone had made a decision to move fast before any counter-narrative could be established. The headline was visible in the notification preview, and it was exactly what Reyes had told her to expect, and it had her full name in it, and the word unauthorized, and the phrase civilian interfered with active military incident. But that wasn't what made her stand up. What made her stand up was the second notification, arriving 3 seconds later, from a number she recognized as belonging to Doris Langham's personal cell. The text said 4 words: come in, right now. She was in her car 11 minutes after the text came through. The drive to Langton Memorial took 8 minutes on a clear morning. Emma used 6 of them going over what she knew and 2 of them not thinking about anything, which was a technique she'd developed years ago for the space between knowing what was coming and arriving at it. You could prepare or you could breathe. She'd learned the hard way that trying to do both at the same time produced neither. The hospital parking lot had 2 vehicles she didn't recognize near the main entrance, sedans, civilian plates, but positioned with the deliberate purposefulness of people who wanted to be visible. Press. She pulled around to the staff entrance on the east side and badged in and took the stairs. Doris Langham's office was on the 3rd floor, administrative wing, corner room, with a view of the parking lot and the highway beyond it. Emma had been in that office 4 times in 2 years, once for her initial contract review, once during a departmental restructuring discussion, once when a patient had filed a complaint that turned out to be about a different nurse entirely, and once when Doris had asked her, out of what seemed like genuine curiosity, how she'd ended up in Langton. Emma had given a version of the answer that was technically accurate and completely uninformative. Doris had seemed to accept it. She was not accepting things this morning. She was standing at the window when Emma came in, which told Emma that she'd heard the badge reader at the stairwell door and had been waiting. Doris Langham was 54, composed in the way that people who've spent decades managing institutional crises were composed. Not calm, exactly, but controlled, her emotions running underneath the surface at a pressure that was always audible to people paying attention. She turned when Emma closed the door. "Sit down," she said. Emma sat. "The article," Doris said. "I saw it." "Then you saw your name and you saw the word unauthorized." She moved to her desk but didn't sit, stood behind it with her hands flat on the surface. "I've had 3 board members call me in the past 40 minutes. I have 2 reporters outside who want a hospital statement, and I have a legal affairs call scheduled for 9 o'clock that I need to walk into with some understanding of what I'm dealing with." "What do you want to know?" "Were you authorized to do what you did at that event?" Emma looked at her. "I was a volunteer medical responder. I responded to a medical situation. The call sign was a clinical tool. I used it to de-escalate a patient in a dissociative crisis who was holding a weapon. It worked. He was stabilized." Doris studied her for a moment. "The article says you retained classified material from a prior military service period. The article is characterizing a memory as material. That's a distortion. Can you prove that?" "There's nothing to prove. I didn't carry a document out of a building. I know things. People know things from their jobs. That's not a legal violation." "Emma," Doris's voice shifted into something that wasn't quite softer but was more direct. "I've watched you work for 2 years. I know what kind of practitioner you are. But I'm being asked by people with institutional authority over this hospital to consider whether your continued presence on staff creates a liability exposure." She paused. "I need you to tell me something I can use." "Use for what?" "To keep you here." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a truck moved slowly through the parking lot. "There's going to be a counter record filed," Emma said. "Military documentation that supports my account of what happened yesterday and provides context for the call sign. It's already been submitted. It'll be accessible through official channels within the next 24 to 48 hours. Doris's expression changed slightly. "From whom?" "Commander Nolan Reyes, the patient I treated. He filed something already." "Last night." Doris was quiet. She was running calculations, the visible kind where you could watch someone sorting and weighing and organizing. "That doesn't solve the immediate problem," she said finally. "The article is up. The board is reactive. Until that counter record is public, I know. I may need to place you on administrative hold, not termination, not a disciplinary action, just a pause," Emma said. "Yes." Emma looked at the window. "How long?" "Days, maybe less, until the legal picture is clearer." "Okay." Doris blinked. Whatever she'd been expecting, that wasn't it. "Okay?" "I'm not going to fight you on this, Doris. You're managing an institution. I understand the calculation." Emma stood up. "But I want something in return." "What?" "When the counter record is public and the board sees it, we have a real conversation about what I can offer this department and whether the terms of my employment reflect it." Doris looked at her for a long moment. "That's a negotiation." "It's a condition," Emma said. "Not a threat, a condition." Doris nodded once, short and precise. "Agreed." Emma left the office, took the stairs back down, and sat in her car in the staff lot for a few minutes. Administrative hold. It was the cleanest version of a bad outcome. No formal record, no cause notation, just a pause while people sorted things out. She'd been managed around before. The difference was that this time, the ground was shifting in a direction she hadn't fully mapped. Her phone buzzed. "Reyes." She answered. "The article's been picked up by 3 national outlets," he said without preamble. "I know. What's the status on your filing?" "DIA confirmed receipt at 0600. Foss is coordinating a review. The problem is the timeline. Official review processes move at their own speed. And the people pushing the narrative are moving fast. Doris is putting me on hold. A brief pause. How long? She said days, I don't know. I'm making calls, he said. It was the second time he'd said that, and this time it landed differently. Not as reassurance, but as statement of fact from someone who had already been making calls for several hours and was measuring the results. Who? She said. People who were there, Hollow Ridge. I've gotten 2 of my unit on the phone already. Vargas and Okafor. They both want to file supporting statements. She closed her eyes briefly. Vargas she remembered as a voice, a dry, precise voice that had a tendency to narrate its own actions under fire, which was unusual and had occasionally been useful. Okafor she remembered differently, as a silence that meant concentration, because he went quiet when things got hard. They don't have to do that, she said. They want to. It exposes operational detail they may not want public. They were on the phone within 4 hours of the video going out. His voice had an edge that wasn't anger exactly, more like conviction with a sharp side. Emma, they recognized the call sign in the video. They knew it was you before your name was out. They've been waiting to do this for 4 years. She didn't have an answer to that wasn't going to embarrass her, so she didn't say anything. There's one more thing, Ray said. Tell me. The source, the person who fed the narrative to the press. Whitmore thinks he has a name. Who? Colonel Dex Hargrove. SOCOM, Personnel Division. He was involved in the deactivation of the 117th and the sealing of the personnel files. A pause. He was also one of the officers at your debrief. Emma's hand tightened on the phone. She remembered the debrief table. She remembered the men across from it. She remembered Hargrove specifically, not because he'd said the most or been the most aggressive, but because he'd said almost nothing and watched everything, which in her experience was the more dangerous configuration. He has something to protect, she said. The 117th deactivation was rushed. Some of the decisions made around it, resource allocation, personnel handling, mission authorization levels, don't look clean in retrospect. If Hollow Ridge goes back into review as a result of today, those decisions are going to get light on them. And Hargrove's name is on some of them. Whitmore thinks at least 2 of the authorization decisions bear his signature. Emma looked at the hospital's exterior wall through her windshield, the gray stone of it, familiar and currently strange. So he's not just protecting a reputation, she said. He's preventing a review. That would be my read. She thought about Foss's words from the night before. High enough that you should be careful. Higher than she'd initially mapped. Okay, she said. There's going to be a press briefing, Reyes said. Unofficial. Vargas and Okafor want to be on camera. I'm working on getting a venue and a journalist who isn't already in Hargrove's pocket. We need... He stopped talking. Emma heard something in the background on his end. A door, voices, a specific quality of disruption. Nolan. Hold on. His voice had changed, gone on flat in the way it did when he was assessing something. She heard him say something to someone else, not into the phone, and then a longer pause. Nolan, what's happening? There are 2 people here, he said. JAG officers. They have paperwork. She sat up straighter. What kind of paperwork? Another pause. She heard a voice in the background say something that included the phrase pending investigation. They're citing my debrief filing as potentially containing unauthorized disclosure of classified operational detail, Reyes said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the tightness underneath it, the particular register of a man who has just watched the game change boards. They're asking me to surrender the filing and submit to a formal review of the material before it can be entered into the official record. Emma was very still. They can't do that, she said, and then immediately, can they? They're doing it. The filing was already confirmed received. Foss confirmed it. Foss confirmed DIA received it. This is coming through a different channel. SOCOM, legal. Another pause. Hargrove. The parking lot around her was starting to fill her morning arrivals of hospital staff, the ordinary business of a Tuesday, people who had slept normally and were starting their days without federal paperwork and national press coverage. Emma watched a woman in scrubs walk past her car window without looking at it. How long do they have to hold it? She said. Review could take 72 hours, up to 7 days if they extend. And in that window, Hargrove's version is the only version. She pressed her hand flat on the dashboard. Thought. There was a shape to this that she recognized from a different context, the shape of a situation designed not to win outright, but to control timing. You didn't need to suppress a truth permanently. You just needed to suppress it long enough for the counter-narrative to set. Your unit members, she said, Vargas and Okafor, their statements don't go through SOCOM. No, they'd file directly as personal testimony. Then that's what we do. They'd need to move fast, and they'd be doing it against, I know what they'd be doing it against. Call them, right now, while I'm on the phone. Tell them what just walked through your door. A brief silence. Then, all right. She heard him say something to the JAG officers that sounded like he was asking for 5 minutes, and then the line went muffled, not on hold, just covered, and she could hear the distant shape of his voice making another call. She sat in her car and made her own list of what she had. No official documentation, a sealed personnel record, a hospital that had just put her on administrative hold, a colonel who was using legal process to slow down her only documentary support. What she did have: 2 SEAL unit members willing to go on record, an intelligence agent who had confirmed receipt of Reyes' filing before the suppression order, her own memory, which was exact and detailed and completely inadmissible in any formal context, and something else. Something she'd been not thinking about since 7:30 that morning when she'd first seen the article, because it was the kind of thing you held in reserve and thought carefully about before you used. She got out of her car and went back inside the hospital. Not upstairs, not to Doris's office. She went to the ER because that was where she knew the layout and the rhythms and which supply closet had a functioning Wi-Fi signal and a door that locked from the inside. She found the closet, went in, locked it, and called a number she hadn't called in 2 years. It rang 4 times. Then a voice she recognized, careful, slightly raspy, with the particular quality of someone who has spent 20 years in rooms where precise language mattered. Sable. Emma used the only name she had for him because it was the only name he used. Not a call sign, just a name, one he'd given himself before she'd known him and that she'd never questioned. Shadow 1, he said. He didn't sound surprised. I've been watching the news. How much of the record do you have? A pause. Define have. Personnel logs, mission authorization chains, debrief transcripts from the 117th decommissioning period. Those are sealed documents. Sable. Another pause, this one different in quality. I have copies of certain materials that I retained for, let's call it personal archival purposes. Hargrove's signature on authorization decisions around Hollow Ridge. Do you have that? The silence on the line had weight. Why are you asking me this today? He said. Specifically today? Because he just had Reyes' debrief filing suppressed by JAG, and I have maybe 60 hours before his version becomes the official one. She heard him exhale. It was the sound of someone making a decision they'd been holding at arm's length for a long time. The authorization decisions, he said carefully. There were 3 of them. 2 bear Hargrove's signature. The 3rd is someone else. Who? You don't know that name yet. I need to. You need to be sure you want it first, because it's not a colonel. Emma's hand tightened on the phone again. How far up? She said. He told her. She stood in the supply closet in the dark with that information sitting in her chest like something with mass. The refrigerator hum of the hospital around her. The distant sound of the ER, patients and monitors and footsteps. The ordinary machinery of a place where people came to be kept alive. Can you get me documentation? She said. It would take time. I don't have a lot of it. I know. Another pause. Emma, once this moves, it doesn't stop. You understand that. The people involved. This isn't Hargrove covering his paperwork. This is larger than that. And once it's in motion, I know, she said. Do you? Because 2.5 years ago, you made a choice to step back from all of this. You built something in Langton. You have a life there. I have a job there. A pause. I had a job there, and they just made a choice to come after it. Sable was quiet for a long moment. 48 hours, he said. I can have documentation assembled in 48 hours, but I need something from you. What? A public statement. Before I send anything. Something that creates a record of your account in a venue that can't be suppressed through legal channels. If you go on record first and the documentation follows, it corroborates. If the documentation appears first with no statement, it reads like a leak, and they'll go after the source. He was right about that. She knew he was right. I need a journalist, she said. I have someone. Who? Her name is Ren Castillo. She covers military affairs for a national outlet. She's been trying to reach you since 6 this morning. Her number is probably in your missed calls. She's not in anyone's pocket. I know her work. Emma thought about it for exactly 3 seconds, which was as long as she could afford. Send her to Langton, she said. Tell her 4 o'clock this afternoon. Where? Emma thought about Doris's office and the board and the administrative hold and the reporters outside the front entrance. Not the hospital, she said. I'll send you an address. She hung up, unlocked the supply closet door, and stood in the hallway of the ER for a moment. A nurse she worked with, Delia, 3rd year, good instincts, too much coffee, walked past and did a small double take. You're here, Delia said. I heard you were, I saw the... I'm here, Emma said. Is Dr. Castle in? He came in at 7. Tell him I need 5 minutes when he has them. Not urgent, just 5 minutes. She found Castle in his office 20 minutes later. He looked like he'd been there since 5:30, which was probably accurate. She told him, in precise and undetailed terms, that she was going to give a statement to a journalist at 4 o'clock and that there would be documentation following in approximately 48 hours that would address the questions the board was asking. She told him she wasn't asking his permission because she didn't need it, but she was telling him because he deserved the information. He looked at her for a while. Then he said, Is it going to be bad? The documentation. For me, no. For other people? Yes. He nodded once. Do what you need to do. She spent the rest of the morning at a diner 2 blocks from the hospital because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't the hospital and wasn't her apartment, somewhere with ordinary noise and bad lighting where nobody knew her. She ordered coffee and eggs she didn't finish and sat in a corner booth and went over the shape of what was coming. The statement she'd give Castillo needed to be specific enough to be credible and general enough not to trigger a classification argument. She needed to establish 3 things: that her knowledge of the call sign was legitimate, that her actions at Crestfield were consistent with both her clinical role and her prior training, and that the characterization of her as a civilian who'd acted without authorization was false. The third one was the hardest, because the word unauthorized was doing specific work in the narrative against her. It was designed to sound like recklessness, when what it actually described, if anything, was a personnel management decision made by people who'd wanted to close a chapter. She wrote notes on a paper napkin because she didn't want it on her phone. She crossed things out and rewrote them. The woman at the next table glanced at her twice, and Emma gave her nothing to look at. At 1:15, Reyes called back. Vargas filed, he said. 30 minutes ago. Okafor is in the process. They went through their personal legal reps, not military channels. Good. The JAG officers are still here. They're being patient about it in a way that's very deliberate. How are you? A brief pause, like the question surprised him. Fine. Your shoulder. I said fine. You had a... Emma, I'm fine. Focus. She almost smiled. The press briefing. Still happening? Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I've got a venue, a hotel conference room in Billings, civilian space. Vargas and Okafor will be there. I'm working on getting Foss to attend in an unofficial capacity. Hargrove's people will know about it within an hour of it being scheduled. Probably, but it'll be on camera and it'll be done before anyone can file an injunction, and the footage will be distributed before any legal response can be organized. He paused. It's not clean. Nothing about this is clean. No, he agreed. It's not. She left the diner at 2:45 and drove to the address she'd texted Sable, a community room at the Langton Public Library that she'd once attended a CPR recertification class in. It was a Tuesday afternoon. It was available. It was public enough to be safe and quiet enough to work. Ren Castillo arrived at 3:51, 9 minutes early, which told Emma something useful. She was 38, compact, with the efficient movement of someone who'd spent years working in uncomfortable environments and had edited her physical habits accordingly. She had a recorder, a notebook, and the specific quality of attention that Emma associated with people who were genuinely good at something, that total, unperforming focus. Ms. Dalton, she said, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I haven't agreed to anything yet, Emma said. Sit down. Castillo sat. Emma sat across from her. They looked at each other. You've been trying to reach me since 6 this morning, Emma said. 6:04. I had your name by 5:40. How? Volunteer registration records are public documents in Montana. It took me about 20 minutes, she paused. The other outlet that published the piece, they had it first because they had help. Someone fed it to them with the framing already in place. I know. Castillo set her recorder on the table but didn't turn it on. Before we do this, I want you to understand what I'm going to do with what you tell me. I'm not going to protect sources who've fed me bad information. I'm not going to soften a story because it's uncomfortable. If you tell me something and it checks out, it goes in. If you tell me something and it doesn't, I'll tell you it doesn't, and I won't use it. She paused. I've been covering military affairs for 9 years. I know what's at stake when I get something wrong. Emma looked at her for a moment. Turn the recorder on, she said. Castillo turned it on. Emma talked for 74 minutes. Not everything. There were operational details she didn't touch, specifics she kept general, categories of information that weren't hers to give regardless of context. But she gave Castillo the structure of it, the 117th, her role, the nature of the work. Hollow Ridge in enough detail to be credible without being a security breach, the debrief, the way the unit had been decommissioned, and her decision to leave. She talked about Langton and what she'd built there and why. She talked about Crestfield, not as a hero's account, but as a clinical account, the decision-making process, what she'd assessed, what she'd done, why. She talked about Hargrove's name in the way that could be attributed as on the record, and she said clearly that she believed the campaign to characterize her actions as unauthorized was originating from someone with a professional interest in preventing review of the 117th deactivation decisions. She didn't say Sable's name, she didn't say the other name, the one that wasn't a colonel, because she didn't have the documentation yet, and she'd learned a long time ago that an allegation without support wasn't a truth, it was a liability. Castillo asked sharp questions. Emma answered the ones she could, and said clearly which ones she couldn't. At some point in the second half, Castillo turned a page of her notebook with more energy than necessary, which Emma read as the tell of someone who was working hard to stay professionally, even because what they were hearing was significant. When it was over, Castillo turned off the recorder and looked at her. The documentation you mentioned, she said. When? 48 hours. And the press briefing tomorrow. Emma raised an eyebrow. I heard about it, Castillo said simply. Not apologetically, just factually. Then you're ahead of me, Emma said. Are you going to be there? Emma had not thought about that specific question until this moment. She looked at the table. She thought about Doris Langham and the administrative hold and the hospital board and the 4 million views and the word unauthorized sitting in print with her name next to it. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Castillo gathered her recorder and notebook. At the door, she stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, she said, what you're describing about the deactivation decisions, if the documentation supports it, this is bigger than you. I know. Are you prepared for that? Emma looked at her. I've been prepared for it for 4 years, she said. I was just hoping I wouldn't have to be. Castillo left. Emma sat alone in the community room for a few minutes. The overhead lights were the fluorescent kind that hummed at a frequency you stopped hearing after a while. Outside the window, the afternoon had gone gray again, clouds stacking up over the mountains to the west. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Ray's. Check the news. Hargrove gave an on-camera statement. He said your actions at Crestfield put a wounded soldier's life at risk. He's calling for a formal civilian oversight review. She read it twice. Then a second text came through, 4 seconds later, from a number she didn't recognize with an area code she placed as Washington, D.C. The text contained no words, just a name she already knew, the one Sable had given her that morning, the one that wasn't a colonel. And below it, a single sentence. We need to talk before tomorrow. She stared at the name on her screen for a long time. Brigadier General Miles Austin. Defense Acquisitions and Special Programs, Pentagon. She'd never met him in person. She'd seen his signature once at the bottom of a resource authorization document during the 117th's final operational quarter, and she'd registered it the way you registered things in that world. Filed it, weighted it, moved on. She hadn't pulled on that thread because there'd been no reason to. Austin's name on a document wasn't unusual. He signed a lot of documents. That was what his position existed to do. Except Sable had told her this morning that the third authorization decision around Hollow Ridge, the one that wasn't Hargrove, bore a signature that wasn't a colonel's. And now that signature was texting her from a Washington area code at 4:50 in the afternoon, asking to talk before tomorrow. She could think of two reasons a brigadier general would contact her directly. The first was that he wanted to negotiate, to understand what she had and what she intended to do with it, and to offer something in exchange for nothing public. The second was that he wanted to assess her, to find out how much she knew before deciding how hard to push back. Either way, he was scared. People at that level didn't make direct contact with problems they weren't scared of. They had people for that. The fact that this text had come from a personal number without identification told her he'd gone around whatever staff structure would normally insulate him. She typed back, "Tomorrow morning, Billings, 8 o'clock. She sent the address of the hotel conference room that Reyes had booked. If he showed up, she'd know it was negotiation. If he didn't, she'd know it was the other thing. She drove home. She ate something, toast, an apple, the remaining half of a container of soup from 3 days ago. She sat at her kitchen table with her notes from the Castillo interview and went through them, not revising, just reading, checking the shape of what she'd said against the shape of what she knew, looking for gaps. There were two places where she'd been general when she could have been more specific, and she noted them. There was one place where she'd characterized a decision that she should have described rather than characterized, because characterization was argument and description was evidence, and evidence was what she needed more of. At 9:15, Reyes called to tell her that Okafor's statement had been filed and confirmed, and that a legal firm in Washington that specialized in military whistleblower cases had reached out to both unit members within an hour of the filings going through. Someone was paying attention to the record in real time. "Hargrove knows the statements are in," Reyes said. His legal team filed a response within the hour claiming both statements contain operationally sensitive material that should be subject to classification review before publication. Same play as your debrief filing. Same play. It won't stick as long. Personal testimony from individuals about their own experiences is harder to suppress than a formal debrief record, but it buys time. "Did you get my message about Austin?" A pause. "I got it. I ran the name through two people I trust. His fingerprints on the Hollow Ridge authorization chain aren't common knowledge. If Sable has documentation, he says 48 hours. We may need it sooner." Reyes' voice had the controlled quality again, the tightness she'd learned to read as him managing something he wasn't saying directly. "There's a story moving tonight, not Castillo. A different outlet. It's going to reframe Crestfield as a security breach, not just unsanctioned interference, but an active compromise of classified operational history by a former intelligence operator with unverified motivations." Emma was quiet for a moment. Unverified motivations. That's the phrase. They're implying I'm a threat. They're implying you're unstable, someone who retained classified material, who inserted herself into a military incident, who is now making contact with active duty personnel and giving interviews to the press. They're building a picture. She understood the architecture of it clearly now. Hargrove and Austin behind him weren't just trying to discredit her account. They were trying to discredit her. If they could establish a narrative in which she was a liability, a former operator who'd gone sideways, someone whose actions were driven by personal grievance rather than professional instinct, then everything she said became suspect. The call sign became evidence of instability rather than competence. The Castillo interview became the action of someone with an agenda. Even Reyes' testimony could be framed as the misplaced loyalty of a trauma-compromised soldier toward the woman who'd once saved his unit. "How long before the story runs?" she said. "Midnight, maybe earlier." "Who's the source?" "Multiple anonymous sources with knowledge of the 117th deactivation." He paused. "Which means either Hargrove has more reach than we mapped, or someone else is feeding it." Austin. It didn't need to be said. "Okay," she said, "I need you to do something. Tell me." "The press briefing tomorrow. I need it moved up. 6:30, not 8. "That's tight." "I know. But if that story runs at midnight and the briefing is at 8, we're behind the whole morning news cycle. 6:30 catches the early feeds. It's on record before most people have read the midnight piece." A brief silence. "That means Vargas and Okafor need to be in Billings by 6. Can they do it?" Vargas is already in Billings. Okafor is in Missoula, 4-hour drive if he leaves by 2 in the morning. Call him now. I will. A pause. What about Austin? I told him 8 o'clock. If he shows up to an empty room, that's useful information. If he shows up early and finds a press briefing in progress. She left that sentence where it was. Emma. His voice shifted slightly. The story they're building, if it runs tonight and gains traction before we can respond, I know. It could affect tomorrow. The way people receive what Vargas and Okafor say. The way Castillo's piece lands. I know, Nolan. I just want to make sure I've thought about it. She kept her voice level. I've thought about all of it. I've been thinking about it since 2 in the afternoon, and I've been thinking about variations of it for 4 years. I know the risk. She paused. Make the call to Okafor. He made the call. She spent an hour doing the thing that was hardest, nothing. She couldn't produce documentation that wasn't ready. She couldn't stop a story from running. She couldn't move the legal processes that were grinding against Reyes' filing and the unit members' statements. All she could do was sleep, which she attempted with limited success, setting her alarm for 4:30 and lying in the dark listening to the particular quality of silence in her apartment building at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The midnight story ran at 11:47. She saw it because she'd set a news alert on Hargrove's name, which she'd done at 9:30 as a practical precaution. The notification hit her phone while she was technically lying down but functionally staring at the ceiling, and she read the piece on her phone in the dark. It was carefully constructed. No direct accusations, nothing that would create immediate legal exposure for the outlet. Instead, it was built on the architecture of insinuation, a former intelligence operator who had left service under ambiguous circumstances, who had retained what sources described as classified operational knowledge, who had made contact with an active duty SEAL commander following a public incident, and who was now engaged in what multiple officials characterized as a coordinated campaign to pressure military institutions into revisiting sealed operational records. Coordinated campaign. She read that phrase twice. They'd taken the truth that there were multiple people working to surface accurate information and reframed it as a conspiracy. It was technically accurate and functionally a lie, which was the most durable kind of lie because it survived fact-checking. She put the phone face down and closed her eyes. At 4:30, her alarm went off and she got up, showered, dressed in the specific way she dressed when she needed to be taken seriously. Not in scrubs, not in the civilian softness of her off-duty clothes, but in the dark slacks and gray jacket she'd bought for a conference 2 years ago and worn approximately once since. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. She didn't do that often. She looked like someone who had slept 4 hours, which was accurate. She was in her car by 5 and in Billings by 5:58. The hotel conference room was on the second floor, a neutral beige space with a long table, 8 chairs, and a projector that nobody was using. Reyes was already there, in civilian clothes, his left shoulder visibly favored under the fabric of his jacket. Vargas was there, a compact man in his early 40s, darker skinned, with the precise economy of movement Emma remembered from his voice. He looked at her when she walked in, and something crossed his face that she didn't have an easy word for, some compound of recognition and relief and things that had been sitting a long time. Vargas, she said. Shadow 1. He said it quietly, not performatively, just placing her correctly after years of having her only as a voice and an absence. Emma's fine, she said. Emma, he repeated, like he was filing it. Okafor arrived at 6:12, having driven through the night, and he was larger than she'd imagined from his silences. A broad, deliberate man who shook her hand without theatrical weight and then went to get coffee from the carafe someone had set up in the corner. Ren Castillo arrived at 6:20 with a camera operator. They were not the only press. Reyes had made calls. Emma hadn't fully tracked, and 2 other journalists were there with credentials she didn't recognize, plus a photographer who worked for a wire service. It was more visibility than Emma had planned, and she absorbed that without comment, because the decision had been made and this was the room and there wasn't time to renegotiate the terms. At 6:30, Reyes stood up. He spoke for 11 minutes. He covered his unit's 2019 operation in the terms that were unclassified and his personal testimony permitted, the ambush risk, the intelligence support they'd received, the specific nature of the guidance that had threaded them out of a compromised approach. He didn't use the call sign in the room. He didn't need to. He described the role of the tactical intelligence operator supporting his unit in terms that made the competence of that support unmistakable. He described the decision-making under pressure. He described what would have happened without it. Then he said Emma's name. He said it plainly, not dramatically, the way you say someone's name when you're telling the truth about them. He said it and connected it to the 117th and to Shadow 1 and to the nurse who had been standing in a blue volunteer vest at Crestfield 2 days ago. And he said that her actions on both occasions represented exactly the kind of professional judgment and human competence that the military claimed to value, and that the campaign to characterize those actions as reckless or unauthorized was not a legal position. It was a political one, and it was wrong. Vargas spoke for 6 minutes. He was precise and dry and unambiguous, which matched everything Emma had known about him. He described 3 specific moments during Hollow Ridge where the intelligence guidance they'd received had prevented decisions that would have been fatal, and he described them with the specificity of a man recounting something he'd been over many times in his own mind and had never been asked to say out loud. Okafor spoke for 4 minutes. He was briefer than the others, and the brevity landed harder somehow. A man who didn't use more words than the truth required, saying that he was alive because someone had done their job, when their job was invisible and unremarkable and critical, and that he wasn't going to sit quietly while that person's name was used as a liability by people who'd spent 4 years pretending she didn't exist. Emma had not planned to speak. She'd been the subject of the morning, not the voice of it, and she'd thought that was the right architecture. Let the men who'd been there say what they'd seen, let the record accumulate without her driving it. But when Okafor sat down and the room was quiet for a moment, Castillo looked at her. Not a directive look, just a question. And Emma thought about the piece running at midnight and the word unstable implied in the phrase unverified motivations. And she thought about Doris Langham's office and the administrative hold, and she thought about a reporter at a fairgrounds calling her a bandage person and walking away. She stood up. She spoke for 8 minutes. She did not cover Hollow Ridge in any new detail. Reyes and Vargas and Okafor had covered that. What she said was about the 117th and what its decommissioning had looked like from inside it, and she said it with the same specificity she would have used to brief a situation, accurate, stripped of performance, grounded in what she'd actually observed. She said that the authorization decisions around the decommissioning were not clean, that she had known that at the time and had chosen to leave rather than fight because fighting would have required making private the people who had been on the other side of her radio, and she wasn't willing to do that. She said that the decision to use Hollow Ridge operatives' statements to suppress her account of Crestfield was a mistake, because it had made those people willing to become public, and they hadn't been public before. She said Hargrove's name, on the record, cleanly and without embellishment, as the source of the suppression effort and as a signatory on decisions that warranted review. She did not say Austin's name, because she still didn't have the documentation, and she was disciplined enough to know the difference between what she knew and what she could prove. The room was recording everything. The room had been recording everything since 6:30, and the footage was going to distribute within the hour. At 7:44, while the journalists were still asking questions, Reyes' phone went off. He looked at it, looked at Emma, and stepped out. She kept answering questions. She was aware of him outside the glass panel of the conference room door, standing in the hallway, the particular posture of someone receiving information they hadn't expected. He came back in when the questions were winding down. He waited until the last journalist had what they needed, and then he caught Emma's eye and tilted his head toward the hallway. She followed him out. "Foss," he said quietly. "She just called. The JAG review of my debrief filing, it's been overridden." "By whom?" "Someone above Hargrove's reach." Foss wouldn't specify, but she said the override came from a deputy secretary level and that my filing is being entered into the official record effective this morning. Emma absorbed this. Someone at that level decided Hargrove had overplayed. That's my read. The briefing, it was streamed. Parts of it are already moving on social media. Someone calculated the optics and decided that suppressing the debrief of a decorated SEAL commander in the middle of a live press story was a worse outcome than letting the record stand. Or, Emma said, someone at that level knows what's in the record and wants it visible before they're connected to the effort to hide it. Reyes looked at her. Austin. If he was the one who reached out last night, he's calculating. He texted me. That's not nothing. That's someone looking for an exit before the room catches fire. Did he show up at 8? It was 7:52. They both knew the answer to that. Give him 8 minutes, Emma said. At 8:01, her phone rang. Washington area code. She answered. Ms. Dalton. Austin's voice was measured and careful, the voice of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where measured and careful was the survival mode. I understand there was a briefing this morning. There was. I wanted to speak with you before that. You had my response. You chose not to be there. A pause. I need you to understand that my involvement in the 117th deactivation was administrative. I signed documents at the request of officers who had operational context. I wasn't fully General Austin. She cut him off, not rudely, just with the same flat precision she used when a patient was heading somewhere clinically counterproductive. I'm going to stop you there. I'm not a journalist, and I'm not a prosecutor, and I'm not the right person to have this conversation with. Whatever you have to say about your level of involvement, you should say it to someone with the appropriate authority to receive it. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to get ahead of documentation that you know exists and that you know is coming, and I understand why. But I'm not going to be the person who decides what your involvement means or what it costs. That's not mine to decide. A longer pause. What are you going to do? The same thing I've been doing, Emma said. Tell the truth. She ended the call. Reyes was watching. She put the phone in her pocket. He's going to cooperate with someone, she said, either proactively or because he has to. Either way, his name is going to be in the record and he knows it. That changes the scope of this, Reyes said. Yes. Hargrove was containable as a colonel protecting his career, a general cooperating with investigators because he's calculating the least damaging exit. That's a different size problem for different size people. She nodded. Sable's documentation should be ready tomorrow. When it comes in, who gets it? Foss, first, and Castillo, simultaneously. Not one before the other? The official record and the public record move at the same time. I'm not giving anyone the chance to suppress one before the other exists. Reyes looked at her steadily. She was aware of him doing the assessment, the same quality of attention he'd had on the ground at Crestfield when he was trying to understand who she was and what she could do. You've been planning this, he said. Not an accusation, just recognition. I've been thinking about it for 4 years, she said. I just didn't know it was going to be this week. They went back into the conference room. Castillo was packing up her equipment. The camera operator was coiling cables. The other journalists had gone. Vargas and Okafor were at the coffee carafe, talking quietly. Castillo looked up when Emma came back in. My piece goes up at noon, she said. The full interview plus the briefing footage. I wanted you to know the timeline. Thank you. One more thing. Castillo set down the bag she'd been packing. Her voice shifted slightly, still professional, but with something behind it that wasn't quite warmth, more like respect with weight to it. The piece that ran last night, the midnight story. I pulled the thread on it this morning. Emma waited. The primary anonymous source, I can't name them, but I can tell you that they made 2 factual claims about your service record that are directly contradicted by the debrief filing that went into the official record this morning, which means either they didn't know the filing existed or they assumed it would stay suppressed. She paused. I'm going to note those contradictions in my piece. By name, source described as senior military official. The outlet that ran the midnight story is going to have a problem by this afternoon. Emma looked at her. That's going to land on Hargrove, she said. If Hargrove is the senior military official who provided false information to a national outlet in order to discredit a private citizen, then yes. Castillo met her eyes. That's going to land exactly where it belongs. She picked up her bag and walked out. Emma stood in the empty conference room for a moment. Vargas and Okafor had finished with the coffee and were moving toward the door. Vargas stopped when he passed her. Shadow 1, he said, and then corrected himself. Emma. Vargas. We should have done this sooner. No, she said. We should have done it exactly now. That's how it worked out. He considered that for a moment and then nodded, once, with the compact precision she'd come to associate with him, and left. Okafor paused at the door. He looked at her long enough that she expected him to say something, but he didn't. He just gave her the specific kind of nod that meant more than a nod, and walked out. Reyes was the last one left. He was standing by the window, looking at the Billings skyline, the low commercial architecture of it, in the early morning light. He looked like he hadn't slept well either, and like he wasn't going to mention it. "Go get your shoulder looked at," Emma said. He turned around. "I had it checked." "By who?" "The hotel has a Nolan, the medic at the base in Billings. I went last night." "And?" "Clean. No signs of infection. I'm on antibiotics." "Are you taking them?" He gave her a look that was almost amused. "Yes." "On schedule?" "Emma, answer the question." "Yes, on schedule. With food." He paused. "You're worse than my last battalion surgeon." "Your last battalion surgeon probably had better lighting and wasn't operating on 4 hours of sleep." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "Not the performance version of it, the plain one." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "That's not why I'm saying it." He moved toward the door and then stopped. "What happens if the documentation comes in and it's bigger than we've mapped? If Austin's involvement is more than an administrative signature?" She picked up her bag. "Then it's bigger. And we do the same thing, put it in the record and let the process run." "You make it sound straightforward." "It's not. But the alternative is leaving it where it is, and I did that for 4 years and it didn't make it smaller." She looked at him. "It just made it quieter, and quiet isn't the same as gone." She drove back to Langton. Castillo's piece went up at 12:03, and Emma knew because her phone became unusable within 15 minutes of that. Calls, texts, notifications from platforms she hadn't opened in months. Her name moving through the digital architecture of a story that had grown past what she'd started in a community room on a Tuesday afternoon. At 1:47, Doris Langham texted her. "Board meeting tomorrow at 10. Your administrative hold is under review. Be available." At 2:15, Sable texted a single word. "Soon." At 3:30, a notification from a military affairs newsletter she followed told her that Colonel Dex Hargrove had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review of his conduct related to the public characterization of a former military intelligence operative. She read that 3 times. Then she set the phone down on her kitchen table and looked at the wall. It wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. There was still Austin, still the documentation coming, still the board meeting and the administrative hold and the long tail of a story that had gone national. There were still people who'd woken up that morning and read the midnight piece before Castillo's noon piece and were carrying the wrong version of events. There was still the question of what the formal investigation would look like when it eventually started, and who would be in the room for it, and whether the process would move with anything like the speed of the damage it was meant to address. None of that was resolved. None of it was clean. But Hargrove was on leave. And at 4:08 in the afternoon, her phone rang with the Nevada area code she'd now recognized in her sleep, and she answered, and Reyes said, "Did you see?" "I saw." "That was fast." "The briefing footage," she said. "Once it was circulating, they had to move. The optics of defending him got too expensive." "Is that a win?" Emma looked out her apartment window. The mountains were visible to the west, clear today. The clouds from yesterday burned off. She'd been looking at those mountains for 2.5 years without really thinking about what was on the other side of them. "It's the beginning of one," she said. There was a beat of quiet on the line, and in that quiet something shifted slightly. Not in the facts, which were all still present and arranged exactly as they'd been an hour ago, but in the weight of them. The way weight changes when you've been carrying something a long time and someone else has put their hands under part of it. "Sable's documentation," Reyes said. "When it comes in, tomorrow probably, or tonight. When it does, if Austin's name is on what he says it is, this gets bigger before it gets smaller." "Yes." "Are you ready for that?" She thought about the community room and the coffee she hadn't finished. She thought about Roy and his knock on a metal table. She thought about a mountain in 2019, and a frequency in 7 men in 43 minutes, and the way silence felt afterward. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of the worst thing not happening, which was its own kind of noise if you knew how to hear it. "I've been ready," she said. "I've just been waiting for the right moment to stop being patient about it." The line was quiet for a second. Then, "The board meeting tomorrow." "I know." "Do you want me there?" She considered it. The offer was genuine and she knew it. And she also knew it wasn't her style to bring reinforcement to a room she could hold on her own. "No," she said. "I've got it." She ended the call, stood up, moved to the window. The mountains sat where they always sat, and beyond them, whatever was going to happen next was already in motion. Documents assembling themselves in someone else's hands, legal processes running their gears, a story circulating in the bloodstream of a news cycle that didn't stop for anyone. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from Sable's number, time-stamped 419. It's done. Sending now. Check your secure email. All 3 authorizations. All 3 signatures. Austin's is the one you'll want to look at twice. She opened the email on her phone. The attachment was there. She started reading. She got to the 3rd page and stopped. The 3rd authorization signature wasn't Austin's name. It was a name she recognized from a completely different context. Not military, not Pentagon, not anything to do with the 117th or Hollow Ridge, or the operational structure she'd spent 4 years quietly mapping in her head. It was a name from a Senate Oversight Committee. A civilian name. A name that, if attached to an unauthorized authorization of classified special operations activity, didn't represent a career problem. It represented something several orders of magnitude larger. She read the name 3 more times to make sure she was reading it right. She was. She sat with the name for 4 minutes without moving. Senator Bryce Callum, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. 18 years in office, 3 committee chairmanships. A public record so clean it had been cited in 2 separate political science textbooks as an example of bipartisan institutional competence. She'd seen him on television twice in the past year, once during a confirmation hearing, once at a press briefing about overseas operations funding, where he'd spoken carefully and at length about the importance of accountability in Special Operations Command. Accountability. She set the phone down on the table. The authorization document on page 3 bore Callum's signature not as an oversight signature, not as a committee member being briefed, which would have been procedurally normal, but as a directing authority. He hadn't been informed of the Hollow Ridge operations resource decisions. He had authorized them, directly, outside the formal committee process, outside the chain of command that should have governed a Special Operations Intelligence Unit's resource allocation. That was not a procedural irregularity. That was not a career problem. That was a sitting United States Senator having operated as an unauthorized directing authority over classified special operations activity, which raised questions about what else he'd directed and what he'd received in exchange for the direction, and those questions were the kind that didn't get asked quietly. She called Sable. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "You saw the 3rd signature," he said. "How long have you had this?" It wasn't a question. He heard it as the statement it was. "A while," he said. "How long, Sable?" A pause. 2 years. She closed her eyes, opened them. "You sat on a senator's unauthorized involvement in classified operations for 2 years. I sat on documentation that I was not positioned to use safely for 2 years. His voice was even, not defensive. The voice of someone who had made a calculation and was willing to own it. "Emma, Callum has oversight authority over the agencies that would investigate him. Taking that document anywhere official 2 years ago would have disappeared, and the person who surfaced it would have disappeared with it. And now? Now there's a public record. Now there are 3 SEAL operators on camera. Now there's a DIA filing in the official record that cannot be suppressed. Now there's a journalist with a national platform who has already connected Hargrove's name to false statements." His voice shifted slightly. "Now there's a context in which that document means something that can't be unmade." She understood the logic. She didn't like it. She didn't like the 2 years of it, the weight of knowing something that size and holding it, but she understood it. "Who gets this?" she said. "Not the committee. Not any committee Callum has reach into." He paused. "DOJ Public Integrity and the Inspector General for the Intelligence Community. Simultaneously. I've already drafted the transmission. I needed your confirmation before sending." "Why mine?" "Because you're in the document. Because your unit's work was the thing he authorized without standing to authorize it. Because you have a right to decide whether this moves." She stood up and walked to the window. The mountains in the late afternoon light, the sky behind them going orange at the edges. She thought about what Reyes had said that morning. This gets bigger before it gets smaller. And she thought about the shape of what she was about to confirm and what it would cost people and what it would correct and whether those things were even the same category. They weren't always. She knew that. Sometimes the truth cost more than the lie it replaced. And you still told it, Not because it was easy, but because the alternative was being someone who knew and said nothing, and she'd been that person long enough. "Send it," she said. She heard him exhale. Not relief, more like the sound of a long-held tension releasing its first increment. "It's gone," he said 30 seconds later. She thanked him and hung up and stood at the window for a while longer. The orange at the edges of the sky deepened toward something close to red. She made herself eat dinner, real food this time, not toast, not cold soup, and she did not look at her phone for 90 minutes, which was the hardest 90 minutes she'd spent in recent memory, and she'd had a fairly dense week. At 8:47, she allowed herself to check it. 17 messages. Reyes twice, Castillo once, Foss once, numbers she didn't recognize. She read them in order. Reyes had heard from a contact at DOJ that a document submission had triggered an immediate preliminary review. Castillo had information she wanted to discuss before morning. Foss's message was brief. "I know what you sent. Correct call. Stand by." She called Reyes back. "Callum," he said before she'd spoken. "Yes." A beat of silence that had real weight in it. "Emma, I know. That's not Hargrove. That's not even Austin. I know what it is. The blowback from this is going to be what it is. Nolan." She kept her voice even, not because she felt even. She didn't. She felt the specific cold clarity of someone who has done an irreversible thing and is standing on the other side of it, but because even was what the moment required. "What would you have done?" He was quiet for a moment. "The same thing." "Then we're done discussing whether it was right." Another pause. "Hargrove's leave was made permanent this afternoon. His personnel file has been flagged for the review. His legal team filed a statement saying he intends to cooperate fully, which means he's already negotiating terms. Fast. The briefing footage is at 9 million views. When you move that fast in front of that many cameras, the people behind you make decisions quickly. 9 million. She hadn't looked at any of that. It didn't feel real in the way the mountains felt real, or the way the patient in room 4 last Thursday had felt real, or the way Reyes' shoulder wound had felt real under her hands. 9 million was a number. The compound fracture in room 4 had been a person. "The board meeting tomorrow," Reyes said. "You want me there or not?" I said no. "I know what you said. I'm asking again." She almost smiled. "No, but thank you." She slept better that night. Not well. She didn't think she was the kind of person who slept well during things like this, and she wasn't sure she'd want to be. But better. 4 hours became 6. She woke up at 5:30 with the particular clear-headedness that came from having made decisions she could live with, and she made coffee and sat at the table and read the morning's coverage. Castillo's updated piece had gone up at midnight, incorporating the confirmation of Hargrove's permanent leave and a statement from a DOJ spokesperson that the Public Integrity section had received materials under review without further comment. The piece was careful and specific and did not mention Callum by name, because Castillo was too good a journalist to name a sitting senator on documentation she hadn't independently verified. But the shape of what was coming was visible in the way she'd written around it, the deliberate negative space of a story that knew what it was waiting for. 3 other outlets had picked up the briefing footage with analysis. One had published a detailed breakdown of the 117th's operational history using declassified records, which told her that the unsealing of Reyes' debrief filing had already begun to loosen things that had been held tight. A retired intelligence official had given a statement to a wire service describing the 117th's work as among the most effective tactical intelligence support of the decade, which was accurate and had the additional effect of landing squarely against the narrative that had been built around Emma as an unstable liability. At 9:15, she drove to Langton Memorial and went to the 10th floor. Doris Langham's board meeting was already in session when Emma arrived. She could see through the glass panel of the conference room, 8 people around the table, Doris at the head, several faces she recognized from the hospital's organizational chart, and several she didn't. Doris saw her through the glass and made a brief gesture that meant wait. Emma waited in the hallway. She stood with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and she did not perform composure, she just had it, because she'd done the thing she'd needed to do, and what happened in this room was a consequence of that, not the cause of it, and consequences were manageable. Doris came out at 9:42. She looked at Emma for a moment with the expression Emma had seen the morning of the first conversation, the recalibration look, the updating the model look, except that it was different now in a way that was hard to specify exactly. Larger, maybe. The model being updated was larger. "The hold is lifted," Doris said. Emma nodded. The board reviewed the briefing footage and Castillo's piece in the DIA filing summary. A pause. "There's a member who wanted to wait for the DOJ process to resolve before reinstating. The others overruled him. I appreciate it." "Emma." Doris's voice shifted into something that wasn't administrative. "I owe you an apology. The hold was the right institutional call given what I knew at the time, but—" She stopped. "I should have asked you more questions before I made it." Emma looked at her. "You managed your institution. I don't have a problem with that." "I do," Doris said. "I have a small one." Something about the precision of small one made Emma trust it more than if she'd said a large one. "Okay." "The conversation you asked for," Doris said, "about what you can offer this department and whether the terms reflect it. I'd like to have that this week." "I'll be here." She went back to work. Not immediately. She sat in the staff break room for a while first, drinking coffee that was better than the coffee at the Crestfield Fairgrounds, which wasn't a high bar. Delia found her there at 10:15 and stood in the doorway with the specific expression of someone who has a great deal to say and isn't sure what order to say it in. "You're back," Delia said. "I'm back. I've been watching the news." "I know. Everyone has." "Are you—" Delia stopped, started again. "Are you okay?" Emma considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I'm tired," she said, "and I'm okay. Both things." Delia nodded like that made sense, which Emma appreciated because it did. "Dr. Castle was asking about you." "I'll find him." She found him in the ER at 11, between patients, writing notes with the focused efficiency he brought to everything. He looked up when she came in. "You're on the schedule for tomorrow," he said. "I know. I'll be here." He looked at her for a moment. "Oren," he said, using his own first name, which he almost never did, which told her the register had shifted. "How much of what's been in the news, how much of that was you actually carrying before this week?" She thought about the honest answer. "Enough of it," she said. "Not all. Some of it I put down when I came here. Some of it I thought I'd put down." "And now?" "Now it's in other people's hands, the parts that needed to be." She paused. "Which is a strange feeling." "Good strange or bad strange?" She thought about it. "Just strange, like when a bone sets. It's not comfortable, but it's correct." He seemed to accept that. "We have a GSW coming in at noon," he said. "Hunting accident. You want it?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. The GSW was a 53-year-old man named Derek, who had managed to graze his calf with his own rifle while getting out of a truck and was deeply embarrassed about it. And the embarrassment was making him both more talkative and more difficult than the wound warranted. Emma treated him with the same focused attention she brought to every patient, and when he asked her, mid-treatment, whether she was the nurse he'd seen on the news, she said yes. And when he said that was something, she said thank you. And when he said he didn't understand what all those military people had done to her, she said it was a long story, and she handed him the aftercare instructions and told him to keep the wound clean and dry. The afternoon moved through her in the way good shifts did, not easily, but productively, each problem specific and answerable, each answer mattering in the clear and immediate way that she'd come back to nursing for. At 3:47, her phone buzzed with a news alert. She was between patients. She looked at it. Senator Bryce Callum had announced that he would not seek re-election at the end of his current term. His office had released a statement citing the desire to spend more time with his family and reflect on his years of service to the American people. The statement did not mention the DOJ Public Integrity Review. It did not mention Hollow Ridge or the 117th or any authorization documents. It was a graceful, vague, carefully worded piece of political self-preservation, and anyone who read it against the week's events would understand exactly what it meant. Emma read it twice. She thought about the word accountability and the way he'd used it at that press briefing a year ago, and the way it sat now against the shape of his exit. She put her phone away and went back to work. 3 days later, Brigadier General Miles Austin submitted a voluntary statement to the DOJ Public Integrity Section, acknowledging his role in the Hollow Ridge authorization chain and characterizing his actions as having been conducted at the direction of a senior civilian official whose authority he had not independently verified. His attorney released a statement confirming that Austin was cooperating fully with investigators. His Pentagon position was suspended pending review. The day after that, a formal military inquiry was opened into the decommissioning decisions around the 117th Tactical Intelligence Unit. The inquiry was announced through official channels with language that was precise and deliberately unremarkable, the kind of announcement that meant very little on its surface and everything beneath it. Hargrove's attorney, the same week, confirmed that her client had entered into a cooperation agreement with investigators. Hargrove's retirement papers were filed the following Monday. The position he vacated in SOCOM Personnel Division was restructured. None of it was fast. None of it was clean. Inquiries moved at their own, which was not the speed of a news cycle or the speed of a person's need for resolution. Emma watched it unfold in the same way she watched patient recoveries, tracking the relevant indicators, adjusting expectations against the evidence, resisting the impulse to declare anything finished before it was. She had learned, over time, that institutions moved badly and slowly, and that this did not mean they didn't move. It just meant you had to have a longer view than felt comfortable. What she had not expected, or had expected in the abstract and not in the specific emotional reality of it, was Ren Castillo's full feature piece, which ran 11 days after Crestfield, and which was not about the political dimensions of Hollow Ridge or the Senate oversight implications or the inquiry into the 117th. Those things were covered, but they weren't the center. The center was a woman who had spent years doing work no one was allowed to know about, and then spent years doing work in a different room with different tools and the same fundamental purpose, and who had been dismissed and managed around and called a bandage person, and who had kept her hands moving anyway because she was good at what she did, and that didn't require anyone's acknowledgement to remain true. Castillo had written it from their interview and from the briefing footage, and from conversations with Reyes and Vargas and Okafor and Castle and apparently Roy, who had told her accurately that Emma had known within 40 seconds of hearing the first gunshot exactly what she was going to do. She read the piece on her phone on a Wednesday morning before her shift. She read it once through and then set it down and sat with it for a minute. It was the first time anyone had written the full shape of her in a way she recognized. Reyes called that afternoon. "The piece," he said. "I read it. Castillo got you right." "She did most of it right. What'd she miss?" Emma thought about it. "She made it sound like I always knew I was doing the right thing, like I was certain." "You weren't?" "There were about 6 different points this week where I genuinely wasn't sure if I was doing something brave or something that was going to blow up everything I'd built in Langton. And I did it anyway. But being uncertain about something and doing it anyway is different from being certain. It's not better or worse. It's just different." "More accurate," he said. "Yes." A pause. Then, "I've been talking to the training division at Fort Keswick." Fort Keswick. She knew it. A base in Colorado, special operations training infrastructure, one of the larger ones. "About what?" she said, though she had a sense. "There's a gap in how elite units are trained to integrate tactical intelligence support with field medical decision-making. The two skill sets exist in parallel, but they don't talk to each other in the way they should. Operators know one, and medics know the other, and the overlap—" He paused. "The overlap is where the hard decisions live, and nobody's currently teaching it." Emma didn't say anything. "It would be a program," Reyes said, "not a posting. A collaborative development role, civilian contract, your terms, structured around your current work, so you're not walking away from nursing completely." "Who'd I be working with?" "Me. Initially. I've been asked to lead the development phase." A pause. "Vargas has also expressed interest. Okafor is thinking about it." She looked out the window of the break room. The mountains, as always. The clouds moving across them the way they always moved, slow and indifferent and somehow reassuring. "I'm not a soldier," she said. "I haven't been for a long time." "I know." "The program would need to respect that boundary. I'd be there as a practitioner and a former intelligence operator, not as someone who's going back into a command structure." "That's the design." "And Langton Memorial would have to agree to a modified schedule." "Have you talked to Doris?" "Not about this specifically." "Maybe start there," he said. "Maybe." She talked to Doris the next morning. The conversation she'd asked for, about what Emma could offer and whether the terms reflected it, had been scheduled for that afternoon, but Emma moved it up because she'd learned that when you had information relevant to a conversation waiting to surface, It was just a form of control that didn't serve anyone. She told Doris about Fort Keswick and what Reyes was building and what it would mean for her schedule. Doris listened with the full attention she brought to information that required real assessment rather than procedural response. How often? Doris asked. To be negotiated. I'd want to keep primary ER hours here. Fort Keswick would be development work, workshops, curriculum design, some on-site delivery. And the terms of your employment here? Emma looked at her. I'd like my contract reviewed. My current classification doesn't reflect the breadth of what I do in this department. Castle knows it. I suspect you know it. Doris didn't blink. I've known it for about a year. I was waiting for you to raise it. I'm raising it. Yes, Doris said. You are. She made a note. I'll have HR prepare a revised structure. You'll review and we'll negotiate from there. That works? And Fort Keswick doesn't take you away from here. No. Emma said it clearly. This is where I live. This is my work. Fort Keswick is something I'm adding to it, not replacing it with. Doris nodded once, the kind of nod that settled things. The formal inquiry into the 117th decommissioning ran for 4 months. Emma gave testimony twice, once to DOJ investigators and once to a Senate subcommittee that was not the committee Callum had chaired, because that committee had quietly reconfigured its membership in the interim. Her testimony was specific and complete and delivered in the same register she used for everything that mattered, without performance, without embellishment, with the accuracy of someone who had kept their own account straight for years in anticipation of a moment exactly like this one. Hargrove's cooperation agreement resulted in a formal censure, loss of retirement benefits at the senior grade, and a permanent bar from federal contracting. He gave a statement through his attorney that characterized his conduct as errors in judgment under pressure from superior authority. The statement was accurate in the narrow way that statements written by attorneys were accurate, which meant it was true and insufficient at the same time. Austin's cooperation resulted in a similar outcome: reduced retirement benefits, permanent removal from any advisory role in defense or intelligence, and a public notation in the inquiry's final report that his authorization of classified activity without standing had violated both statute and the trust of the institutions he'd served. He did not give a public statement. His attorney said he accepted the findings. Callum did not seek re-election. The DOJ declined to file criminal charges, citing insufficient direct evidence of knowing criminal intent as distinct from reckless disregard, a distinction that Emma read about in the inquiry's published summary and sat with for a long time. Reckless disregard was not a crime. It was a description. It was also, she thought, a more accurate indictment than the legal category of intent could capture because it named the actual mechanism. Not malice, but the particular arrogance of people who believed that the systems they operated were too large and too opaque for anyone to find the thing they'd hidden in them. They had been wrong about that. That was the finding. She thought about it on a Thursday morning in November, sitting in a small conference room at Fort Keswick with a whiteboard behind her and 12 special operations soldiers in front of her. She was midway through the third session of the curriculum she and Reyes had been developing since September, a program called Timed for Tactical Integration of Medical and Environmental Decision-Making, which was a name that Vargas had suggested and that everyone agreed was correct and slightly ungainly, which seemed about right. She'd been running the medical side of the curriculum. Reyes and Vargas ran the tactical intelligence integration sessions. Okafor had come on 2 weeks into development and was teaching the section on communication under high-stress conditions, which turned out to be the section that generated the most silence from the participants, which was always the sign that something was landing correctly. The soldiers in the room were not what she'd expected, which meant she hadn't examined her expectations carefully enough, which was a habit she'd been working on correcting. She'd expected people like she'd worked around in the 117th, technically excellent and interpersonally compressed, trained to minimize the surface area of their own reactions. Some of them were that. But some of them were also 23 years old and asking questions she hadn't heard in years, genuine questions without tactical positioning, about what you did when the decision in front of you didn't match the training you'd received for it. That was the question the program existed to address. That was the gap Reyes had named correctly. The overlap is where the hard decisions live. She answered those questions with the same directness she brought to everything. She told them that training gave you a structure and experience gave you the ability to deviate from the structure correctly. and that the ability to deviate correctly was not something you could fully teach. It was something you developed by paying attention to the right things for long enough that the right response became available to you before conscious deliberation could slow you down. She told them that the right things to pay attention to were the things in front of you, the actual person, the actual situation, the specific data of the moment, and not the category you'd place those things into, because categories were approximations and approximations cost you precision at exactly the moments when precision was the only currency that mattered. One of the soldiers, a young woman, 24, with the particular focused stillness of someone who was going to be very good at this work, raised her hand. "What if the thing in front of you is bigger than your training?" she said. "What if the situation is, what if you're not enough for it?" Emma looked at her for a moment. "Then you use what you have," she said. "All of it. Not the part your official record says you have. All of it. The stuff you learned before the training, and the stuff you learned outside the designated channels, and the stuff you know that nobody put in a document." She paused. "You don't get to pick the moment. The moment picks you. And when it does, you're either going to wish you'd been paying attention, or you're not going to have to wish anything, because you were." The soldier wrote something down. Emma let the room sit with it for a moment before moving on. After the session, Reyes found her in the hallway outside. "The last bit," he said, "about not getting to pick the moment. Too much?" "No, right amount." He paused. "You didn't used to talk like that." "Like what?" "Like someone who knows what they think." She considered that. "I always knew what I thought. I was just quieter about it." "What changed?" She looked down the hallway, the institutional corridor of a military installation, fluorescent and functional, entirely without poetry. She thought about a fairgrounds in Montana, and a parking lot, and a supply closet, and a community room and a conference room in Billings at 6:30 in the morning with cameras and the specific quality of attention from people who had been waiting to say true things out loud. "Someone called me a bandage person," she said, "and I let it stand. And eventually I stopped being willing to let things stand." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Good. It took me a while. Most things do." She went back to Langton that evening. She drove the same road she'd driven 4 months ago in the opposite direction. The valley that narrowed toward the mountains, the brown grassland opening, the sky above it. Doing what the Montana sky always did, which was exist in a scale that made everything below it seem both smaller and more precisely itself. She thought about the young soldier's question. What if you're not enough for it? It was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that didn't get asked out loud in rooms where the expectation was competence. She'd asked it herself in various forms across 15 years, in the 117th, and in the ER, and in a field at Crestfield, and in a community room on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd decided to stop being patient about the truth. The answer she'd given was the true one. You used what you had. And what you had was always, it turned out, more than the official version of you, more than the job title and the clearance level and the contract grade and the designation, more than what any document had ever been able to hold. The skills you kept quiet, the knowledge you carried into every room without announcing, the particular clarity that came from doing hard things without recognition for long enough that the recognition stopped being the point. She pulled into Langton as the sun was finishing behind the mountains. The town arranged itself in the familiar way. The water tower, the highway commercial strip, the hospital on the east side with its lit windows and the ordinary impossible activity of people inside it, keeping other people alive. She parked in the staff lot out of habit and sat in the car for a minute, not because she needed to, just because it was the end of a day. And sitting in the car at the end of the day was something she did, and she was not going to stop doing ordinary things because the extraordinary ones had finally been acknowledged. She thought about Roy, who had texted her last week to say he'd applied to a paramedic program in Billings and wanted to know if she'd be a reference. She'd said yes without hesitation. She thought about Delia, who had quietly started asking her questions about triage decision-making in the way that people asked questions when they were trying to learn something rather than just complete a task. She thought about Castle, who had put her name forward for a department lead role that she hadn't applied for and hadn't expected, and which she was considering with the careful attention it deserved. She thought about Ray's, who she'd heard on the phone yesterday, arguing with someone at Fort Keswick's administrative division about curriculum hours with an intensity that made her think he was going to be a more difficult bureaucratic partner than she'd anticipated, and a more reliable one than anyone would expect. She thought about 7 men in a valley in 2019 who had come home. She got out of the car and badged through the staff entrance and took the stairs. Because she always took the stairs, and she went to the ER and picked up the first chart and started her shift. The bandage work. The unglamorous, precise, irreplaceable work of keeping people alive in the room you were standing in with the tools you had in your hands. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She didn't need a headline or a hearing or an inquiry finding or a national feature piece to make that true. Those things had named it, but they hadn't created it. It had been true in every shift she'd worked in Langton, and in every frequency she'd monitored in the 117th, and in every decision she'd made in the space between what she was supposed to do and what the situation actually required. The truth about a person doesn't wait for someone to discover it. It just waits. And if you're the person carrying it, if you're the one who knows what you know and can do what you can do, even when no one in the room is willing to see it, then the waiting is not the same thing as being wrong. It's just the cost of being ahead of the moment, and the moment always, eventually, catches up.